The Ashford Gala was the kind of room where a single chandelier cost more than most people earned in a decade, where the champagne was older than the waitstaff serving it, and where Delia Brandt moved through the marble hall like a ghost nobody bothered to see. She was 27, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her look older, and her hands told a story the silk gowns around her couldn't. They were chapped and scarred from 16-hour shifts, from scrubbing dishes long after midnight, from holding her mother's frail fingers in a hospital ward where the bills piled higher than hope. To the glittering crowd, she wasn't a person at all. She was the dish girl, a thing to be ordered around and laughed at, a reminder of the poverty they'd spent their whole lives pretending didn't exist. They mocked the way she folded napkins too carefully, as if she couldn't afford to ruin a single one. And they were right, because she couldn't. What none of them knew was that 3 months earlier, in a dark alley behind a shuttered restaurant, this same quiet woman had knelt beside a dying stranger and saved his life without ever asking his name. And what none of them could possibly imagine was that the stranger was about to walk through those gold-trimmed doors. His name was Rourke Vance. He was 37, and he owned half the shadows in New York. The docks, the silent money moving through clean buildings, the kind of power that made senators lower their voices. Men who'd crossed him simply stopped showing up, and the city had learned not to ask where they'd gone. He was cold the way winter is cold, beautiful and merciless. A man who'd clawed his way out of the same gutters these people sneered at, and built an empire so that he'd never again have to bow his head to anyone. For 3 months he'd been searching for the one person who'd shown him mercy when he had nothing to offer in return, the only act of kindness in his entire life that came with no price tag attached. Tonight he'd find her, and he'd find her exactly as they were pouring a glass of blood-red wine down the front of a borrowed white dress, accusing her of theft, emptying her purse onto the floor, so the whole room could laugh at the cheap medication and the folded hospital bills spilling across the marble. They thought they were teaching a poor girl her place. They had no idea they were lighting a match in front of the most dangerous man in the city, a man who'd just recognized the scar on her wrist, the voice he'd never forgotten, and a white dress that pulled him straight back to a sister he'd lost long ago. Before the night was over, an entire dynasty would crumble, and the people who laughed would learn that some debts get paid in full. If a story about dignity, justice, and the kind of love that can pull a ruthless man back from the dark is the kind of story you came here for, do this old storyteller a favor. Hit that like button so more folks can find this tale. Share it with someone who needs to remember that where you come from never decides where you'll end up, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Now then, let's step back into that glittering ballroom, where the wine is about to fall and everything is about to change. 4 hours before that glass of wine spilled, Delia Brandt stepped through the back door of the Ashford mansion, with a uniform bag draped over her arm, and a weariness that had sunk deep into her bones. The service kitchen was as vast as a warehouse, cold white light falling over stacked silver trays, and the smell of hot butter mingled with scented candles into a kind of luxurious fragrance she knew she would never touch. The staffing manager looked her up and down, pausing at the heels of her shoes, already worn thin, then pointed toward the changing corner without bothering to offer even a greeting. Delia was used to that. She was used to the way people's eyes passed over her, as if passing over a piece of furniture, used to clipped orders, used to becoming invisible in the very room she was serving. She lowered her head, quietly walked toward the changing corner, and in that moment the phone in her pocket vibrated once. It was a message from the hospital. This month's medical bill had come due, the bold number on the screen so large that she had to read it twice to make sure she hadn't seen it wrong. Her mother, Coralie, had been in the dialysis unit for nearly half a year, and each passing week added another layer of bills onto a hope that was already thin. Delia drew in a deep breath, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and told herself that tonight, if she finished the whole shift, if she took the extra cleanup after the party, she would earn enough to pay the interest first. She only had to get through tonight. She always told herself that, night after night, like a prayer sent to no one. Just as she was about to put on the familiar black server jacket, a young woman from the coordination team came over, holding a white dress wrapped inside a clear plastic bag. The staff serving the main hall had to wear white tonight, the young woman said, her voice flat as if reciting something by memory. then pushed the dress into Delia's hands before she could ask anything more. Delia frowned at the dress. In all her 3 years working for event companies, she had never seen servers required to wear white, because white was the easiest color to stain, the one color no one carrying food and drinks would ever want to put on. Something was wrong. A vague feeling stirred inside her, but she immediately pushed it away. People like her did not have the right to ask questions. People like her only had the right to obey, lower their heads, and be grateful they still had work to do. She ran her fingers lightly over the soft white fabric, a material far finer than anything she had ever owned, and for one brief second, a very small part of her almost felt warm, as if maybe tonight might be different. She did not know that the dress was not a random arrangement. She did not know that someone had chosen it for her with very deliberate purpose, had calculated every stitch and seam for a performance in which she would become the unwilling main character. Delia only changed clothes quietly in the cramped corner, tied back her hair, wiped her calloused hands dry on the thin towel, then glanced at herself in the cloudy mirror. The woman in the mirror looked unfamiliar, almost beautiful beneath the white fabric, and she quickly turned away because she wasn't used to that image. She thought of her mother lying in a hospital room, dozens of blocks away, thought of what her mother always said whenever life became too heavy, that people could take many things from you, but dignity was only lost when you handed it over yourself. Delia tightened her hand slightly, carrying those words with her like a charm, then stepped out toward the main hall, where the chandeliers were pouring down light like golden rain. She could not possibly have known that somewhere in that glittering crowd, a pair of eyes was already following each step she took, waiting for the exact moment to turn that white dress into a weapon. On the other side of the hall, where crystal glasses glittered beneath the lights, Whitney Ashford stood in the middle of a circle of admirers with a smile so carefully practiced that not a trace of sincerity remained in it. She was 29 years old, the only daughter of the Ashford family, raised in the belief that the whole world had been born to serve her, and until tonight, that belief had never once been shaken. Beside her, Priscilla Vaughn lifted a glass of champagne to her lips, her sharp eyes constantly sweeping the room like a cat searching for prey, ready to join in with whatever her powerful friend desired. Whitney had been enjoying her own evening until a sentence reached her ears and made the glass in her hand freeze in midair. People were whispering that Rourke Vance, the man whose name made this entire city hold its breath, the man the Ashford family was anxiously waiting for to rescue their business dealings, had come here tonight not because of an agreement, not because of numbers, but because he was looking for someone. A woman. That sentence lodged inside Whitney like a thorn. In her mind, Rourke Vance was supposed to belong to her, not because of any feeling, but because that was what someone like her deserved to have, a powerful chess piece she could place on her own board. The thought that some woman, some nameless nobody, could make the most powerful man in New York go to the trouble of searching for her made jealousy flare in Whitney into something far darker. Whitney swept her eyes across the room, and her gaze stopped on a white figure moving quietly among the guests, a server with rough hands and the posture of someone always trying to make herself as small as possible. The little tray-carrying girl, Whitney thought, her lips curving into a cold smile. She didn't know whom that man was looking for, but she knew very well whom she wanted to pour her frustration onto. Whitney tilted her head and whispered into Priscilla's ear, and within a few seconds, the smiles on both their lips had become exactly alike, the smiles of people who had never once paid a price for their cruelty. They had the white dress. They had a plan. All that was missing was the right moment, and the night was still long. In a shadowed corner near the entrance, apart from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, Beckett Lowe leaned against the dark paneled wall, holding a phone whose screen had been lit for quite some time. He was 34 years old, Rourke's right hand, and also the man who kept his books, a quiet man whose face always concealed more than it revealed. For the past 3 months, he had been assigned to quietly follow the trail of the woman who had saved Rourke in that dark alley, a nameless shadow with no address, leaving behind only a few faint fragments of memory in the mind of a man who never accepted owing anyone. And tonight, for the first time, Beckett had reached a lead, a name, a workplace that matched so closely it made his heart slow for one beat. He wasn't completely certain yet. There were still links that had to be verified. but his instinct was almost shouting that the woman was very close, perhaps right inside this room. He should have called Rourke immediately. That should have been what a loyal man like him did, without a second of hesitation. But Beckett didn't call. His finger hesitated on the screen, then slowly turned it off and slipped the phone into his coat pocket, because he understood the world Rourke lived in better than anyone, understood exactly what people often had to pay when they stepped into that world. He had seen too many good people crushed, simply because they stood too close to Rourke Vance's dark light. If that woman truly was his benefactor, a decent person with nothing to do with the underworld, then dragging her into this would be no different from pushing her into an abyss with his own hands. Beckett told himself that he was only delaying to protect her, that he only needed more time to be certain, but deep down, he knew it was also cowardice dressed in the clothing of kindness. He looked toward Rourke standing at the head of the hall, cold and distant, then looked back toward the fragile white figure disappearing behind the crowd, and a vague unease rose in his chest, as if he had just missed his last chance to stop something that was about to shatter. Not long afterward, the young coordinator from earlier came looking for Delia again, this time with a smile so gentle that Delia almost trusted it. She had been assigned specifically to the central hall tonight, the young woman said, where the most important guests were gathered, and only staff dressed in white were allowed to serve there. Delia hesitated, because the central hall had never been part of her station, but the words had been wrapped so skillfully that refusing would seem rude, and someone like her did not have the luxury of refusal. She nodded, accepted the silver tray filled with glasses of champagne, then walked in the direction she had been shown, each step carrying her farther from the service area she knew, farther from coworkers who might be able to speak for her, farther from anyone who might stand on her side if things turned bad. She did not realize she was being separated. She only thought about keeping the tray steady, keeping her smile proper, doing her work well so she could be paid extra tonight. Meanwhile, in the middle of that glittering circle, Whitney began her own performance. She lifted her wrist, lightly turning the diamond bracelet beneath the lights, so that a few people around her had time to admire it, and a little while later, once everyone's eyes had registered it, she quietly unclasped the bracelet and let it slide into Priscilla's palm in a small touch no one noticed. Everything moved smoothly, like a play rehearsed again and again. Only a few minutes later, Whitney suddenly raised a hand to cover her mouth, her face flashing with a look of panic so skillfully acted that the people nearby immediately turned toward her. Her bracelet, she cried out, her voice trembling just enough to be heard. Her mother's heirloom diamond bracelet had disappeared from her wrist. A ripple of agitation spread through the crowd. Glances began circling in search of someone to blame, and Whitney, with the cunning of someone long used to controlling others, allowed suspicion to grow on its own, allowed it to find its way to the easiest target in the room, the only person there who did not belong to their world, the girl with calloused hands in the borrowed white dress. She did not need to point at anyone yet. She only needed to wait. The trap had been set, the bait had been laid, and the prey was quietly walking straight into its center without knowing. Delia carried the tray past the guests, lowering her head as she offered drinks, thanking them in a soft voice, completely unaware that the whole room was slowly turning her into the center of a storm about to break. And then, at that very moment, the air in the hall changed. The laughter suddenly sank. Conversations broke off halfway, as though a cold gust of wind had slipped through the door. At the head of the hall, beneath the gold-trimmed doorway, Rourke Vance walked in. He did not need to speak, did not need to make a single gesture, and yet that crowded room seemed to part by itself to make way for him, the eyes that had been proud only moments earlier quickly lowering as he passed. In a perfectly tailored black suit, his face cold and without expression, he carried a kind of power that did not need to show itself and still made people hold their breath. Whitney recognized him at once, and a triumphant smile spread across her lips, because she believed that this man had come here for her family, for her agreement. She did not know that Rourke's sharp, cold eyes, the moment he stepped inside, had already begun sweeping slowly across the room, not to find the host, not to find the numbers, but to find a figure he had searched for through 3 long months. And in a far corner of the hall, among the silver trays and chandelier light, that figure was standing there, completely unaware, that her whole fate was about to collide with itself in only a few short minutes, Whitney chose the exact moment when the entire room's attention had risen to its highest point to deliver her blow. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out loudly enough for every guest nearby to hear, her slender finger pointing straight at Delia, who was standing there with the tray in her hands. "It was her," Whitney said, her face pretending outrage. "This serving girl was the only one who came near me all evening, and now my bracelet is gone." Delia lifted her head, at first not even understanding what was happening, her eyes looking around in confusion as though Whitney were speaking about someone else. When she realized that every gaze in the room had turned toward her, cold and accusing, the blood in her body seemed to freeze. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice small but trying to remain steady. "I never touched your bracelet." But what weight could the words of a tray-carrying girl have in a room filled with silk and diamonds? Whispers rose, heads shook, eyes filled with contempt, and Whitney knew she had won from the very first moment. Priscilla stepped forward from behind her. "That girl's bag," she said. "Why don't we check her bag?" Before Delia could react, Priscilla snatched the worn cloth bag from her shoulder and turned it upside down onto the marble floor in the middle of the circle. Everything inside spilled out, rolling across the floor beneath the blazing chandelier light, exposed before hundreds of eyes looking down. There was no diamond bracelet. Instead, there was a half-used blister pack of her mother's medicine, several hospital bills folded into quarters, with edges frayed from being opened and closed too many times, a few coins, and a piece of bread carefully wrapped in a napkin, the food she had saved for a late meal after her shift ended. The whole room fell silent for 1 second, then burst into laughter. But it was not the laughter of relief because a misunderstanding had been cleared up. It was the cruel laughter of people who had just found something to mock. Someone spoke up sarcastically, asking whether this girl was so poor she had to wrap leftover bread to take home. Another person covered his nose and said, "No wonder she smelled like the kitchen," and jokes about her poverty, about her lowly background, poured out one after another, as if it were the most entertaining amusement of the evening. Delia collapsed to her knees on the floor, hurriedly reaching out to gather the pills for her mother that had scattered everywhere, gathering the bills that to her weighed more heavily than all those 1,000 insults combined. Her calloused hands trembled against the cold stone, and in that moment, what hurt her most was not the laughter, not the contemptuous eyes of hundreds of strangers, but the feeling that all her quiet sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the meals she had gone without, the sweat she had shed just to keep her mother alive for one more day, were being turned into a joke in front of people who had never known hunger for even one meal in their lives. And then, just as she was still kneeling on the floor, Whitney stepped closer, holding a glass of red wine that shimmered in her hand. "Maybe white doesn't suit someone like you," Whitney said, her voice sweet to the point of cruelty. "Let me help you change into another color more fitting for your place." Then she tilted the glass, and the red wine, like blood, poured straight down onto the white dress Delia was wearing, spreading into a large, ugly stain, soaking through the thin fabric, running all the way to the hem before dripping onto the marble floor. The laughter grew even louder, and someone even clapped in approval, as though they had just watched a brilliant performance. Delia sat motionless in the blotched pool of wine, her hair falling forward to cover her face, and for a moment the whole room believed they had completely crushed this small woman, believed she would burst into tears, would beg, would collapse right there, so they would have one more thing to laugh at. But they were wrong. But Delia did not cry. In the moment when the entire room was waiting for her to collapse, something quiet and resilient inside her stood firm before the storm. She did not lift her head to beg, did not look around for pity from anyone, because she had learned long ago that among people like these, tears were only one more thing for them to sharpen their cruelty against. She bent down, slowly, and began picking up each of her mother's pills that had rolled across the cold stone floor. One pill, then another. She gathered them into her palm with the tenderness people reserve for the most precious thing in their lives, because to her, that was exactly what they were. Each pill was one more day her mother could still breathe, the result of shifts that stretched until dawn, of meals she had given up, of everything she had traded away without once complaining. The laughter around her gradually thinned, because there was something in that quiet posture that began to make people uneasy. She did not hurry, She did not panic. She only calmly collected each of her belongings, folded the crumpled bills again, placed the napkin-wrapped piece of bread back into her bag, as though there were not hundreds of eyes looking down at her, as though the pool of red wine spreading across her dress were nothing more than a stain that would someday fade. Once she had gathered everything that belonged to her, Delia stood up. She straightened her back, composed and unhurried, and for the first time all evening, she lifted her head and looked directly at Whitney without looking away. The red wine still blotched the white dress. A few drops still clung to her hair, but her eyes were so clear and steady that even Whitney felt a sudden flicker of unease. "You can pour wine on my dress," Delia said, her voice not loud but clear enough for every word to echo through the room as it fell silent. "You can dump everything in my bag onto the floor. You can laugh at my poverty until your heart is satisfied." She paused for a breath, her eyes never leaving Whitney's face as it slowly began to pale. "But there is one thing you will never be able to touch," she continued, "and that is my dignity. Because dignity is not something another person can spill onto the floor. It is only lost when I lay it down with my own hands, and that is something I will never do." The room sank into a silence so heavy that people could hear the last drop of wine fall onto the stone floor. The mocking smiles that had been bright only moments earlier vanished from one mouth after another. Several guests awkwardly lowered their eyes, and a few others instinctively stepped back as though they had just realized they had become part of something shameful. The girl they had thought was the weakest prey in the room was now standing there with a presence that made all of them look small inside their glittering clothes. Whitney opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out, because for the first time in her life, she could not find a weapon to use against a person who had nothing but self-respect. Delia did not say another word. She carefully put the bag back over her shoulder, gently smoothed the wet part of her dress with a gesture almost solemn, then turned and slowly walked toward the door, each step sounding through the silence of the entire room. She did not know that from a hidden corner above the hall, a pair of eyes had been watching her from beginning to end, and that the very moment she lifted her head had awakened something the man watching had thought he had buried forever. From the small balcony above the main hall, where the darkness was thick enough that no one noticed his presence, Rourke Vance had stood in silence since the moment the first glass of wine tilted downward. At first, he only watched the scene with his familiar indifference, because he had witnessed too much cruelty in his life to still be surprised by the human heart. But when the girl in the white dress knelt on the stone floor to gather her belongings, something in that posture caught his eyes and refused to let go. Then she stood, lifted her head, and spoke. It was that voice that made his entire body turn to stone. He recognized it, a low, gentle voice slightly hoarse with exhaustion, a voice he had heard again and again for the past 3 months in restless dreams in the middle of the night. The only voice that had ever spoken kind words to him without knowing who he was, without calculating what he might be able to give her in return. His heart beat once, slowly and painfully. His gaze slid down to her hands, the calloused hands cradling the pills, and there, on her wrist, beneath the glittering chandelier light, he saw a small crescent-shaped scar he would never forget, the mark he had once seen very close on that fateful night. It was her, the woman he had searched for across the city, the woman who had pulled him back from the edge he had thought he had already released himself into. She was here, right before his eyes, soaked in wine, and mocked by people who were not worthy to stand at her feet. But it was not only that recognition that tightened his chest. The white dress she was wearing, now stained with red like a wound, awakened another memory in him, a memory he had buried so deeply he had believed it no longer had the power to hurt him. His younger sister, the only person he had ever loved in his dark childhood, had always liked wearing white when she was little, always saying that white made her feel clean in the filthy world where the two of them had been forced to grow up. And it was that same white that had branded itself into his mind on the day he lost her forever. Watching this woman be stained, humiliated in a white dress amid the laughter of the crowd, a smoldering anger in Rourke's chest erupted into the coldest and most terrifying kind of fire, the kind of rage that did not shout, but only tightened in silence, the kind of anger this entire city had learned to fear. When Delia began walking toward the door, her head still held high in the silence of the room, Rourke left the balcony. He descended the grand staircase, each step slow and decisive, and the moment his shadow appeared beneath the lights, the room that had already gone silent seemed to hold its breath even deeper. Whitney saw him coming closer, and a delighted smile flashed across her lips, because she was certain this powerful man was walking over to stand on her side, to help her close out this perfect performance. But Rourke did not glance at her for even 1 second. He walked straight past Whitney as though she did not exist, through the crowd that was parting to either side in stunned silence, and stopped directly in front of Delia. She looked up at him, bewildered, not yet understanding what was happening. In the absolute silence of hundreds of people, Rourke Vance, the man who had never bowed his head before anyone, slowly took off the black jacket he was wearing and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders, covering the ugly red wine stain across the white dress. The gesture was simple, yet so shocking that the whole room seemed to stop breathing. Champagne glasses froze in midair, and on Whitney's face, the triumphant smile slowly hardened into a vague terror as she began to realize that something had completely slipped beyond her control. Rourke slowly turned around, and this time his ice-cold gaze fell directly on Whitney. She instinctively took 1 step back, the smile completely gone from her face. "You said you lost a bracelet," Rourke said, his voice low and even, but each word rang through the silent room like the blow of a hammer. "Then let everyone here find out where it is." He gave a slight tilt of his head, and from behind the crowd, 2 men in dark suits who had been quietly standing guard all this time stepped forward, calm and in no hurry. They did not need to search for long. One of them walked straight toward Priscilla, the woman who had only moments earlier been the most eager to turn Delia's bag upside down, and with just one look he made her face go pale. Trembling, Priscilla stammered out a denial, but her hand had already tightened around her clutch purse by reflex, and that very gesture betrayed her. When the purse was opened in front of everyone, the diamond bracelet Whitney had insisted was stolen lay neatly inside, glittering beneath the chandelier light like an undeniable confession. A wave of shocked murmuring spread through the room. The guests who had been laughing a moment earlier now turned to look at Whitney with completely different eyes. The eyes of people who had suddenly realized they had been tricked into becoming accomplices in a humiliation staged from beginning to end. Whitney opened her mouth, her face twisting with panic, trying to explain that this must have been some misunderstanding, that Priscilla must have done something on her own without her knowing, but no one in the room believed her anymore. Rourke looked at her with cold contempt, then added one more sentence, slowly and sharply, saying that perhaps someone should also ask where the money for such an expensive bracelet had come from, because not every dollar belonging to the Ashford family could withstand the light once it was shone upon it. The sentence was gentle, almost casual, but it fell into the room like a block of ice, and several faces among the powerful guests suddenly went pale, because they understood exactly what he was implying. At that very moment, Edmund Ashford, Whitney's father, hurriedly pushed through the crowd and stepped forward, his face flushed with both anger and worry. He tried to salvage the situation, lowering his voice as he told Rourke that this was only a petty misunderstanding among young people, that they should not let such a small matter affect the great agreement both sides had spent so long preparing, the agreement the entire Ashford family was counting on to raise its wavering fortune back up. Rourke let him finish, did not interrupt, his face not changing by even a single line. Then, when Edmund had just finished speaking, he spoke, and his voice carried so clearly that not a single person in the hall could pretend not to hear. "There is no agreement anymore," Rourke said. "I came here tonight to sign, but I have just seen enough to understand what kind of people your family is. A family willing to trample someone with no way to defend herself just for amusement, a family that teaches its daughter she can humiliate anyone as long as that person is poorer than she is not the kind of family I want my name standing beside. The agreement ends this very second." That declaration struck Edmund Ashford like a fatal blow. His face turned white, his lips trembling without being able to form a word, because he understood better than anyone that the agreement with Rourke Vance was not just a contract, but the final lifeline keeping the Ashford empire, already sinking, afloat. And now, right before the eyes of hundreds of people, that lifeline had just been cut, all because of the jealousy of a spoiled daughter, who now stood frozen in the middle of the room, tasting for the first time in her life the feeling of the ground beneath her feet beginning to crack. News that Rourke Vance had cancelled the agreement spread through the room as quickly as flame, catching dry straw. The powerful guests who had spent the whole evening circling the Ashford family like moths around a lamp now began quietly scattering, one group after another turning their backs and walking away, leaving a widening emptiness around the place where Edmund and Whitney stood. In the world they lived in, no friendship lasted longer than self-interest, and once Rourke Vance had publicly rejected the Ashford family, continuing to stand near them was no different from inviting misfortune onto oneself. Edmund felt every gaze abandoning him, every back turning away, and the despair inside him rose so sharply that it wiped away the polished mask of courtesy he had worked so hard to maintain all evening. He took another step toward Rourke, his voice lowered but urgent, almost pleading. "You don't understand what you're doing," Edmund said, his lips trembling. "If this agreement falls apart, it won't be only me who collapses, but everyone who trusted the Ashford family with their money will lose everything." Rourke looked at him for a long time, then answered in a voice so calm it was chilling, saying that he knew far more than Edmund imagined. He knew that behind these marble walls and lavish parties, the Ashford family had in truth been hollow for a long time, that the fortune they still paraded before the world was nothing more than a glittering shell wrapped around a massive debt. He knew that the numbers in their books had been rewritten again and again to hide the truth, that the money flowing through their shell companies carried a smell that anyone in finance could recognize, though no one dared to say it aloud. And he knew that tonight's agreement, beneath the fine clothing of a glamorous investment, was actually Edmund's last desperate attempt to find someone to shoulder the pit of debt waiting to swallow his entire family. Edmund's face paled piece by piece as he listened, because every sentence Rourke spoke struck precisely at the secrets he had believed he had buried most carefully. "I had people look into you long before I set foot here tonight," Rourke continued, "and everything that needed to be known, I already know. I didn't come here because I needed this agreement. I came because I wanted to see with my own eyes what kind of man you truly were before deciding. And tonight, you and your daughter answered that question more clearly than any contract ever could." Edmund stood there, his mouth opening and closing again, unable to utter a single word in defense, because he understood that he was facing a man who held not only power, but also evidence that could finish him at any moment. His panic slowly turned into a smoldering hatred deep in his eyes, the hatred of a man driven into a corner with nothing left to lose. He glanced at his daughter, then at the young woman in the black coat standing quietly beside Rourke, and in that moment, a dark thought began to kindle in his mind, though he still did not yet know what he would do with it. Rourke did not bother to look at him again. He turned back to Delia, softened his voice, and asked whether she wanted to leave this place, and that unexpected gentleness in the voice of a man who had just been so terrifying stunned the entire room once more. Delia, still not having fully understood everything that had just happened around her, only nodded faintly, and as she walked beside him, through the crowd now parting in silent respect, not a single person in that room dared to laugh anymore at the young woman they had believed, only a few minutes earlier, to be the lowest person there. When the great doors closed behind Rourke and Delia, the room they left behind was no longer the room it had been only minutes earlier. Whitney stood in the middle of the hall in the most magnificent dress of the evening, but now not a single person came near her. The friends who had surrounded her for so many years, the people who had once laughed along with every cruel thing she said, now avoided her eyes as if avoiding something filthy. She heard the low murmurs whispering behind her back, felt the weight of hundreds of judging gazes, and for the first time in her life, the girl who had always been the center of every attention tasted what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back in a single moment. News of what had just happened would spread through the city's upper class before the night was even over. She knew that, and she also knew that the Ashford name, which had once been a passkey that opened every door, would now become the thing that made every door slam shut in her face. Beside her, Priscilla did not even bother to stay and bear the consequences with her. The moment she realized the ship was sinking, she quietly withdrew toward the side door, her head lowered, disappearing from the party so quickly, it was as if she had never been there at all, leaving Whitney alone to face the ruins the two of them had built with their own hands. That betrayal, swift and cold, was perhaps the first bitter lesson Whitney learned on this night when everything collapsed, that those who only know how to gather around us while we still have power will be the first to run when we fall. Outside, in the stone-paved courtyard leading to the line of waiting cars, Rourke paused for a moment to give a few instructions to his men, and it was then that Beckett Lowe stepped closer to him. All evening, he had stood at the edge of everything, watching it all unfold with his heart weighed down by a guilt he could not wash away. Now, as he looked at the woman in the black coat standing quietly beneath the yellow lights of the front courtyard, he understood that he could not keep silent any longer. "I need to tell you something," Beckett began, his voice quiet but firm, and when Rourke turned to look at him, he took a deep breath and went on. "That woman, I found a lead on her a few days ago. I wasn't completely sure, but I had a feeling she was the one you were looking for. I should told you right away, but I didn't." Rourke's face hardened, and in his eyes there flashed something both angry and difficult to understand, but he did not interrupt, only waited for Beckett to finish. "I kept it back because I was afraid," Beckett admitted, his voice lowering. "I've seen too many decent people crushed simply because they stepped into our world. And she's different. She's clean in a way that both you and I lost a long time ago. I told myself that keeping her away from you meant I was protecting her. But tonight, when I saw what she had to endure, I finally understood that I had no right to decide for her what was best for her life. I was wrong, and I'll accept every consequence." Rourke was silent for a long time, his gaze following Delia's figure in the distance, and in the end he only said softly that honesty that comes late is still better than a lie that lasts forever. Beckett lowered his head, and in that moment he knew that he had just chosen to stand on the side of truth, whatever the cost might be, and that from tonight forward, he would never again let fear turn him into a coward. 2 days after the night at the Ashford mansion, Rourke went to the hospital where Delia's mother was being treated. He stood in the doorway of the plain hospital room, his black suit looking out of place among the white walls and the smell of antiseptic, and for a moment, the man who made the whole city tremble looked almost hesitant, unsure whether he had the right to step inside. Delia was sitting beside the sickbed, wiping her mother's forehead, and when she looked up and saw him, her whole body went still. She had recognized him that very night, from the moment he draped his coat over her shoulders, but only now, seeing him standing there beneath the soft, pale hospital lights, did the memory return in full. Those eyes. She would never forget those eyes, the eyes she had once seen so close in a dark night, when she knelt beside a stranger who seemed as if he might not survive and did everything she could to keep him in the world of the living. "It was you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The man in the alley that night." Rourke nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had met him again, that cold gaze of his softened slightly. "You saved me without asking who I was," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "You stayed with a stranger when the rest of the world surely would have walked away. I've been looking for you for 3 months." Those words should have warmed Delia's heart, but instead, a deep conflict rose inside her. She had heard people whisper the name Rourke Vance, had seen an entire room filled with powerful people hold its breath when he walked in, had witnessed him bring down a whole family with only a few words. The man standing before her was not the poor stranger in the alley from that night, but a force she could not understand, and her instincts told her she should be afraid. Gratitude and caution wrestled inside her, leaving her unsure whether she should step back or allow herself to trust him. Rourke seemed to read that struggle on her face. He did not come any closer, only quietly said that he knew about her situation, about the bills, about her mother's illness, and that he wanted to take care of the full cost of treatment, that to him it was only a small number. It should have been the kind of offer anyone in her position would kneel down and thank him for. But Delia only shook her head quietly. "I thank you," she said, her voice small but steady in the same way that had silenced the whole banquet hall. "But I can't accept it. I didn't save you that night to get anything in return, and if I take your money now, then what I did that night will become a transaction. My mother taught me that there are things that once traded away can never remain whole, and my self-respect is one of them." Rourke looked at her, and in his eyes there was something both startled and difficult to describe, because in his whole life he had never met anyone who refused his money, and even less someone who refused it for a reason so pure. Just as the air between them stretched tight in silence, the hospital room door opened, and a man around 40 in a white coat stepped inside, holding a folder of medical records. It was Dr. Finch Holloway, the physician who had been directly treating Delia's mother over the past several months. He stopped short when he saw Rourke, and in one very quick instant, so brief almost no one could catch it, his face seemed to pale, his eyes flashing with the unease of someone who had just come face to face with the thing he feared most. He quickly regained his composure, smiled in greeting, and began speaking about the patient's condition, but that fleeting moment of confusion had planted a seed of unease, whose true meaning Delia would only understand much later. In the days that followed, Delia began learning about the man who had entered her life in such a strange way. She did not have to search for long, because the name Rourke Vance was spoken in cautious whispers, accompanied by quick glances around, as if people were afraid someone might hear. She learned that he controlled the city's ports, that his money slipped through countless buildings with clean-looking faces, that those who had once dared stand against him all shared the same ending, disappearing from this world in ways no one dared to ask about. Every new thing she learned deepened the conflict inside her. The man who had draped his coat over her shoulders, who had protected her before an entire room full of cruel people, was also the man whose hands were stained with things she did not dare imagine. How could one person be both her benefactor and the very thing her conscience warned her to avoid? She lay awake for many nights beside her mother's hospital bed, wrestling with that question and finding no answer. Then one afternoon, when Rourke came to visit again, Coralie, Delia's mother, was awake enough to sit up against the pillows. She looked at the unfamiliar man standing in the doorway for a long time, with eyes that had passed through so much suffering in life that they had become strangely perceptive. "Come closer so this old woman can see you a little more clearly," she said, her voice weak but warm. Rourke, who had never obeyed anyone's words, somehow stepped closer to the sickbed and sat down in the chair beside it. Coralie looked into his eyes for a long while, then smiled faintly, a sad and gentle smile. "You're very lonely, aren't you?" she said, not as a question, but as something she had seen clearly. "I've lived long enough to recognize the eyes of someone carrying too much loss inside with no one to share it." Those words left Rourke stunned. All his life, people had looked at him and seen only power, seen fear, seen what they needed from him, or what they dreaded in him. No one had ever looked through all those layers and seen the naked loneliness beneath. In that moment, something inside his chest, something that had been frozen for so many years, cracked slightly. He did not answer her, but his silence was already an answer. Delia stood in the corner of the room and witnessed it all, and she felt her heart soften in a way she had not expected. When Rourke was about to leave, she walked him out into the hallway, and after hesitating for a while, she spoke. "I've thought about it a lot," she said. "I still can't accept your money as charity, because then I wouldn't be myself anymore. But if you truly believe you owe me your life, then I'll accept your help as a debt being repaid, nothing more and nothing less, between two people standing as equals." Rourke looked at her for a long time, and he understood that she had just given him a dignified way out, a way for him to help her without taking away her self-respect. "All right," he said softly. "Then it is a debt I'm repaying." And as he walked down the hospital corridor, for the first time in many years, that powerful man felt something strangely light inside him, something almost like being forgiven. Rourke's visits gradually became more frequent, and each time, the ice around him melted a little more before Delia's calm presence. She was the only person who was not afraid of him. While the whole world lowered its voice and dropped its eyes whenever he appeared, she looked straight into his eyes and told him the things no one else dared to say. One evening, when he mentioned the way he had dealt with a man who betrayed him in his familiar cold tone, Delia set down her teacup and told him directly that the way he lived was wrong. "You make people afraid," she said, "but fear is not respect, and an empire built on other people's terror, no matter how large it becomes, is still only a prison, and you are the loneliest prisoner inside it." Rourke was silent for a very long time, and Delia thought she had crossed the line, but he did not get angry. No one had ever dared speak to him that way, and instead of enraging him, that honesty touched some deep place inside him that had been sleeping for years. Then late one night, as the two of them sat in the empty hospital corridor, Delia gently asked him about the younger sister he had once mentioned at the banquet, the one who wore white. She asked very softly, ready to retreat if he did not want to answer. But this time, Rourke did not avoid it. He looked into the space before him, and for the first time in his life, he told the story. He told her about a childhood spent growing up in the poorest neighborhoods of the city, where hunger was a familiar companion, and kindness was a luxury no one had enough of to give away. He told her about a mother who died early, about a father drowned in liquor, and about the little sister who was the only light in that dark world, the sister he had promised to protect with his whole life. The two siblings had leaned on each other through winters without heat, through meals where a single piece of bread was split in half, and his sister, no matter how poor they were, always kept her white dress clean, as if it were a declaration that poverty could not stain her soul. But then one day he could not protect her. His voice sank lower when he reached that part, and he did not give the details, only said that his sister died because the two of them had been too poor. Poor enough that they did not have the very thing that should have been able to save her, and that the people with power and money at the time had turned away, as if the life of a poor child was not worth noticing. That day had killed a part of him and given birth to the man she saw now. "I swore I would never let myself be weak again," he said. "I built all of this so no one could ever turn away from me again, so no child carrying my name would ever have to die just because they were poor. I thought power would fill that emptiness. But it never did." Delia listened, and when he finished, she did not offer any hollow comfort. She only quietly placed her calloused hand over his, a gesture so simple and warm that Rourke almost forgot how to breathe. In that moment, in the silent hospital corridor at midnight, two people from worlds so far apart suddenly realized that they understood each other in a way no one had ever understood them before, and both of them felt something gentle and dangerous quietly taking root between them, something neither of them yet dared to name, while something tender was quietly growing between Rourke and Delia. On the other side of the city, Edmund Ashford was sinking into the mire of despair. Since that fateful night, everything he had spent his whole life building had collapsed at dizzying speed. Creditors came knocking one after another. Partners who had once flattered him now did not even bother to pick up the phone, and rumors about the true state of the Ashford family spread through the financial world like an oil slick. The authorities had also begun looking into the murky numbers in his books, and though he was still out on bail while everything was investigated, Edmund understood that it was only a matter of time before every prison door closed behind him. A man driven to the end of the road is a dangerous man, and in that desperation, Edmund did not turn his hatred toward his own mistakes, but poured it all onto the young woman he believed was the source of every disaster. If that serving girl had not appeared, he told himself in his madness, if Rourke Vance had not turned his back because of her, then his family would have been saved. Edmund longed for revenge, but he had neither the courage nor the strength to face Rourke directly. So he turned to Delia's weak point, the one thing anyone could clearly see, her mother lying in a hospital bed. And Edmund had a card no one expected. Many years earlier, he had held a secret over Dr. Finch Holloway. During a difficult period, the physician had once allowed the Ashford family to draw him into falsifying certain medical records to profit from insurance claims, a mistake he had regretted for years but could never escape, because Edmund had always kept the evidence hanging above his head like a blade. Now, when he had nothing left to lose, Edmund used that filthy card. He met Finch in a hidden corner, and in a voice both sweet and threatening, he demanded that the doctor find a way to harm the course of Delia's mother's treatment, enough to make her conditions worsen without anyone suspecting anything. In exchange, Finch's secret from years ago would be buried forever. Finch heard those words and felt his whole body turn cold. Though he had made mistakes in the past, he was not an evil man, and deliberately harming an innocent patient, a gentle woman fighting day by day to stay alive, went far beyond every limit his conscience could bear. But Edmund gave him no way out, repeating again and again that if he did not obey, not only his career but his whole family would be dragged down with him. For many days afterward, Finch lived in terrible conflict, trapped between the fear of losing everything and the voice of conscience that would not let him sleep. In the end, it was that remorse that won. He could not use his own hands to push an innocent human being toward death in order to save himself. But he also knew that if he only quietly refused, Edmund would find another way, something even more vicious. So he decided to do the only right thing. He found a way to sound the alarm. One evening, Finch quietly recorded Edmund's threatening conversation, then went to Delia, his hands shaking, his face pale with both fear and regret, to confess everything and warn her that her mother was in far greater danger than she imagined. The moment Finch confessed, Delia called Roark, her voice trembling with fear. He did not let her finish her sentence, only told her to lock the hospital room door and wait, then immediately sent his men on their way. But Edmund, once he could not force Finch to obey, no longer had the patience to wait for subtlety. That very night, he sent several of his men to the hospital, intending to directly strike the woman lying in the sickbed and complete his cruel revenge. The hospital corridor late at night was quiet and dark, with only the footsteps of strangers echoing across the tile floor. Delia heard the unusual sound outside the door, and the instinct of a daughter told her that danger had arrived. She did not hesitate. She rushed to stand in front of her mother's bed, spreading her arms wide to shield her like a mother bird opening its wings before a storm, even though she knew very well what a small woman like her could possibly do against those men. When the door was shoved open, Delia still stood firm in that place, her eyes not retreating at all, and in that moment, every fear inside her vanished before one single truth, that she would rather endure anything than let anyone touch her mother. A struggle broke out. She was shoved to the floor and struck the edge of the table, a sharp pain spreading through her arm. But she still forced herself up, still tried to crawl back toward the sickbed to shield her mother, repeating again and again that she wouldn't let them touch her. It was at the moment that seemed most hopeless that Roark's men rushed in. They appeared at the head of the corridor like shadows, swift and decisive, and in only moments they had subdued Edmund's men, pinning them down and neutralizing the threat before the worst could happen. Roark was the last to step inside, and when he saw Delia sitting on the floor, one hand still clutching the rail of her mother's bed, her other arm scraped and trembling, her face pale but her eyes still shining with an unyielding strength that refused to bow, something in his chest seemed to break open. He knelt beside her, and for the first time in his life, that cold man revealed a naked fear, the fear of someone who had almost lost the most precious thing he had only just found. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his hands, so used to power, now trembling as he gently lifted her injured arm. Delia looked at him, and everything she had held back over the past days suddenly broke into tears, not because of pain, but because for the first time after too many years of carrying everything alone, she felt that there was someone willing to race through the whole night to come to her side. "My mother," she sobbed, "please, don't let them hurt my mother." Roark raised his hand and gently wiped the tear from her cheek, and in a voice more tender than any he had ever used with anyone, he promised her that as long as he was alive, no one would ever touch her or her mother again. Roark's men traced the footsteps of the hired attackers and quickly found the place where Edmund was hiding, an old warehouse on the edge of the port district that he had believed was safe. When Roark stepped inside, Edmund knew the end had come. He backed slowly into a corner, every trace of pride from a distinguished family falling away, leaving only a trembling man facing the one person whose most precious thing he had dared to touch. Roark advanced, each step slow, his face cold as ice, and in his eyes was the fury he had held back the entire way. He had intended to end everything right then and there, in the way this entire city knew he could. A man who had dared strike at Delia, and her mother did not deserve to see sunlight one more time. That was what the old self inside him screamed. But at that very moment, Delia appeared in the doorway. She had guessed that he would come here, and she had followed with everything she had left in her, her arms still bandaged. "Don't," she called, her voice ringing through the darkness. Roark stopped but did not turn around. "He deserves to pay," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He tried to kill your mother." "I know," Delia answered, tears sliding down her face, "and I hate him for that more than anyone. But if you do this tonight, you will forever become the man he turned you into, and I'll lose you forever." She stepped closer to him, slowly, then spoke the things she had kept in her heart for a long time. "Do you know why I didn't leave that night in the alley?" she asked. Roark stood silent. She went on, her voice choking, saying that on that night, when she happened to find him, he had not only been wounded in body. In his eyes then was surrender, the eyes of a man who no longer wanted to hold on to his life, a man who had lost everything and was ready to let the darkness take him. "I saw that," Delia said, "and I stayed not only to save your life, but because I couldn't abandon a human being sinking into such despair." My hand held you there that night, not only holding on to your breath, but holding on to the last part of the man still left inside you. So I'm begging you, don't let tonight destroy the very human part I risked everything to save. Let the law punish him. Don't put your hands into something that will kill your soul." The entire room sank into silence, with only the wind slipping through the cracks of the old warehouse. Rourke stood there, torn between the ruthless man he had been for so many years, and the man Delia was pleading for him to become. He looked down at his hands stained with too much darkness, then looked at the tear-soaked face of the woman who had once knelt beside him in the night and asked for nothing. And for the first time in his entire life, Rourke Vance let go. He lowered his arm, drew in a deep breath, then turned his back on Edmund, who was cowering in the corner. "The law will deal with you," he said, his voice no longer filled with rage, "and that will be a punishment heavier than anything I could do." When he walked toward Delia and reached out to support her, both of them understood that something had just changed forever, that in the moment he chose to let go, the man who had once bowed before darkness had taken his first step toward the light. The evidence Dr. Finch had bravely gathered, together with everything Rourke held in his hands about the Ashford family's shady activities, was enough to seal Edmund's fate. Not long after the night at the warehouse, he was arrested, and this time there was no deal, no powerful connection, that could save him anymore. The charges piled up one upon another, from financial fraud and falsifying records to plotting to harm an innocent patient, all exposed to the light before the public. The man who had once walked through lavish parties with the grand bearing of a prince now had to lower his head and pass through the gates of prison, and the whole city witnessed that collapse as a reminder that no marble wall can forever hide the rot inside. Meanwhile, under the devoted care of Finch once more, the doctor, now freed from the chains of the old secret and determined to atone for his mistake with every bit of conscience left in him as a physician. Corley's health gradually improved. Day by day, a little more color returned to her face, and strength infused back into her hands. Soon, her gentle laughter began to sound again in the hospital room, where worry had ruled for far too long. To Delia, there was no gift in the world more precious than that. One afternoon, while Delia was sitting beside her mother, Beckett came to see her. He stood in the doorway for a long while, hesitation clear on his face, then finally stepped inside and apologized to her. He confessed that his silence in those early days, the fact that he had hidden the lead about her, might have made everything more complicated and more dangerous, and that he had been tormented by it without rest. He did not ask for her absolution. He only wanted her to know that he was truly sorry. Delia looked at him, at the man who had once chosen wrongly out of fear but had finally returned to what was right, and she smiled faintly. "I forgive you," she said softly. "Hatred is only a burden, and I've already carried enough burdens in my life. You chose to stand on the side of truth when it mattered most, and to me, that is enough." Beckett lowered his head, and in that moment he felt that a part of the weight that had pressed on his heart for so long had been lifted, as though her compassion had just given him a chance to begin again. As for Whitney, there was no prison to confine her, but she lived in a prison of another kind. The Ashford name that had once been a ticket opening every door now became a stain that made every door close. The people who had once surrounded her were no longer beside her. The invitations to elegant parties stopped forever, and she was forced to learn how to live an ordinary life she had never prepared herself to face. Her fall did not come with one thunderous explosion, but slowly, quietly, through the forgetfulness of the very world she had once believed would belong to her forever. A bitter reminder that glory built on contempt for others can never stand for long. The night Rourke let go in the old warehouse did not only spare Edmund's life, but also opened a new path for his own. The man who had once built an entire empire on fear now began a task more difficult than anything he had ever done, dismantling that very creation with his own hands. He knew he could not erase what had passed, could not completely wash clean a past stained by darkness, but he could choose the man he became from this day forward. Step by step, Rourke began cutting away the hidden businesses that had formed the roots of his power. He had his men withdraw from the murky operations at the ports, closed the dark doors through which money had once slipped, and gradually moved his enormous fortune into legal businesses, transparent beneath the light of day. It was not an easy process, because in the world he had once ruled, retreating was every bit as dangerous as advancing, and many people who had grown, used to profiting from the darkness, were not about to leave him in peace. But Rourke faced all of it with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him so far, this time with an entirely different purpose. Beckett, who had now become his most trusted right hand on this new road, stood beside him through every step, helping him turn money that had once remained silent in the shadows into something that could create goodness under the sun. And among everything he did, one decision carried the deepest meaning of all. Rourke invested a large sum in the very hospital where Delia's mother had been treated through those hard months, the hospital where he had once stood in the doorway and felt, for the first time, the ice inside his heart begin to melt. He had a new treatment wing built, sponsored poor patients who could not afford to pay, and established a support fund bearing the name of his late sister, so that no family would ever again have to lose someone they loved simply because they were too poor, just as he had once sworn during the darkest years of his life. Every brick laid down, every life saved because of his help, became a quiet act of atonement for the things he could not change in the past. People in the city began speaking the name Rourke Vance in a different way, no longer in fearful whispers, but with astonishment at the transformation of a man everyone had thought was no longer capable of changing. Delia witnessed all of it, and though she had never demanded that he do anything to prove himself, she understood that this was not a change made to win her heart. This was a man sincerely trying to find his way back to the goodness he had thought he had lost long ago. And whenever she saw him absorbed in those new projects, his eyes no longer carrying the cold emptiness of the past, but instead a gentle light belonging to someone who had found a reason to live, Delia knew that the hand she had once reached out in that dark alley had ultimately saved far more than she had ever dared to hope. As life gradually returned to peace, Delia made a decision she had cherished for a very long time, but had never dared to think about during the hardest days of struggle. She went back to school, continuing the path of nursing she had been forced to leave unfinished years earlier because of the burden of survival. She did not accept Rourke's support as a way to become a dependent shadow beside him, but walked forward on her own 2 feet, studying and working at the same time, because to her, self-respect was still the most precious thing she protected. Rourke understood and respected that. He never tried to turn her into a woman living in silk and luxury only to lose herself. On the contrary, he loved in her the very strength and independence that had once made her stand upright in that banquet hall years ago. The most beautiful thing in their story was not that a poor girl was lifted up by a powerful man, but that a decent human being had pulled a man once drowning in darkness back into the light. She did not become corrupted by his world. Instead, her love and goodness transformed the man inside him, leading him out of the darkness where he had thought he would remain for the rest of his life. They came together, not because she needed his protection, or because he needed her salvation, but because both of them saw in each other what the whole world had once missed, a human being worthy of being cherished. Coralie, now healthy again, often smiled as she looked at her 2 children, because she had always considered Rourke her son from the day she saw through the loneliness in his eyes, and she often said that a person's dignity had never lived in the clothes they wore or the money they possessed, but in the way they treated those who could give them nothing in return. And that is also the deepest thing left behind by this story, that a person's true worth is never measured by birth, wealth, or status, but by the kindness and respect they give to others, especially to those weaker than themselves. A glass of wine can be thrown onto a white dress, but no humiliation can stain the dignity of a person who knows their own worth, and sometimes, one small act of kindness, given without calculation, has the power to save an entire life and light up even the darkest corners of the human heart. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day we can listen together to many more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Delia and Rourke's story? And what have you taken for yourself from their journey? Please leave a comment below and share your honest feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear every line of your thoughts. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment, and may you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.